Okay, so the headline that I saw in the newspaper for this particular case was "She loved her so." The rest of the headline was something to the "She loved her so she tried to kill her." But essentially, that is the headline that caught my eye for this story, and I was like, okay, I must read this. So essentially, this story takes place in the 1920s. I'm sorry, this case. This is actually a real life case. Isn't some story that I'm making up. So the case started in 1920 in Chicago area. And I found this story to be extremely interesting. So let me kind of give you a synopsis of what happened. We have two girls. One girl falls in love with the other girl. The other girl is like, I don't feel that way about you. So everyone ended up getting shot. That's essentially the gist of the story. Everyone gets shot up over this little love affair situation that's going on. This one-sided love. Now, historically, why this story is important. This story is important because it is very rare to get any type of information about lesbian relationships and how people viewed them, how the media viewed them in this country. So this story is historically important because, to be honest, whenever you're looking at the 1920s, 1940s, 50s, 1800s, whenever there's any talk about homosexuality, it always involves men, and it's always very harsh tone taken by the news, the media, and stuff like that about those types of relationships. But in this case, I was shocked by how the media in the 1920s portrayed this type of relationship. And so this makes this case very interesting, but also the twists and turns and what goes on in the situation. I'm like, at one point, I was like, honestly, I was like, girl, you need to sit down somewhere. Like, you need to calm down. Like, the story is so interesting. The media coverage gives lots of insight into what society felt, how society felt about lesbians at this time. So let's get started. Okay, I'm Angela Willis, and I am a historian slash history teacher, and I like to use criminal cases, murder cases that mostly involve women to really teach history and really give people a better understanding of American history or any history in general. I don't just stick to murder cases involving Americans. I kind of do branch out and look at cases from all over the world. Today's case is about Jeanette. Jeanette is from Chicago, and she grew up in the 1920s. And she comes from what appears to be a upper middle class lifestyle. And when she was around 18, 19, she had a best friend. So she had a best friend named Catherine. They were good friends, and they were like always around each other for about 2 years. And at some point, they move in together as roommates. And I do know that Catherine worked. I'm not for sure if Jeanette worked or her dad just paid for everything. But for whatever the case, they move in together. And once they move in together, Jeanette tried to court Catherine. So she starts bringing her home flowers and candy and gifts. And she was always hanging around her and hugging her and kind of being a little bit inappropriate. So Catherine did not feel the same about Jeanette, but they stayed friends. Now, I think you have to read in between the lines a little bit. I think this friendship was very one-sided. I think it's a friendship in which one person is benefiting more than the other. I think Catherine understood how Jeanette felt and enjoyed the gifts, the money, hanging out, getting to do things that maybe she could not have afforded to do on her own. And that you really have to read between the lines, because it appears that Jeanette was very open with her friendship, adoring Catherine. And I think Catherine liked being able to go shopping and all these other things, but Catherine was not looking for a relationship. She just liked to getting Jeanette to buy her stuff. And that's really what we're kind of seeing, because I'm like, okay, she's buying her stuff, which is weird. Uh, Flowers, candy, all these things seemed a little bit weird off the jump to me. And I would not feel comfortable then moving in with the person who was doing all these things for me, whether it's a man or a woman. If you're buying me stuff that you would buy someone you're in a relationship with, or, someone you're dating, flowers, candies, little gifts, you know right off the bat that this person likes you and they're doing these things for you. I would not then move in with them if I did not have the same feelings as them. But for whatever reason, Catherine moved in with Jeanette. And as Jeanette became more affectionate towards her, she doesn't seem to be put off. Essentially, what ends up changing is that Catherine goes on a trip out of town to visit family. So she goes on a trip out of town, and when she returns, she no longer wants the gifts. She no longer wants the affection. She no longer wants to live with Jeanette, and so she moves out. So it really appears that something went on when Catherine went to go visit her family. Now, it could have been she met a guy and she was interested in that guy and she didn't want to come back and continue to live with Jeanette. Whatever the case, there is a split in the friendship. And Catherine moves back home with her family, and she cuts off all ties to Jeanette. She says, I don't want anything to do with you. I'm cutting off all ties. Jeanette does not handle this well, and Jeanette continues to try to get in contact with Catherine, try to understand, why are you doing this all of a sudden? What happened? Because they were best friends for several years. And so it all stopped suddenly for Jeanette, even though Catherine might have had her reasons. So what ends up happening is Jeanette continues to try to contact Catherine over and over. And then one day she sends her a letter. This letter contains a bullet. And the police call this letter the bullet letter because they're so creative, but they call it the bullet letter. And in the letter, Catherine is shocked by what she reads, but Catherine isn't directly threatened. So this is what the letter said. The letter said, is from Jeanette, I am going to kill myself unless you start talking to me again and helping me understand what is going on and be my friend again. And then Jeanette enclosed a bullet saying, this is the bullet I'm going to use to kill myself unless you start talking to me and we become friends again. And I think because the letter did not say, I'm going to kill you, Catherine wasn't really fearful of her life. And she kind of was just like, oh, okay. And she kind of blew it off. And so Catherine blows off this letter and does not communicate with Jeanette. Here's where things get dicey. Jeanette decides she is going to go to Catherine's job, and she takes a loaded weapon with her. As she's going to Catherine's job, Jeanette sees Catherine at the platform of the public transportation system. And I don't know why the newspapers did this or what was the point, the newspapers did a whole diagram about what happened, and they even used, it looks like a comic book. So let me show you. I'll probably insert a better picture of it, but this is essentially it. So this is Jeanette, and we know that the platform was packed full of people, full of commuters. This girl goes, sees Catherine on this platform full of people, and pulls out the gun and starts shooting with hundreds of people in this enclosed area on the platform. The platform meaning where you walk up to as the subway is coming so that you can get onto the subway. That platform where everyone's standing waiting for the subway. This girl pulled out a gun and started shooting into a crowd and magically hits Catherine like 3 times on this crowded platform. And here's the thing, and the newspapers caught on to this. As the crowd sees the gun and they're like trying to come at her, Jeanette was like, y'all stay back or I'm going to shoot you. And so she was able to corral this huge crowd with men and everything, and they backed away. They were like, oh, she really is crazy. She really is crazy. So she kept the crowd at bay and then just shot Catherine. And nobody tries to stop her once she stops shooting. She just turns around and literally, like, here's the picture. So this is her on the platform. That's the platform. You see everyone's walking down, and you see the subway right here. You see her holding the gun, and there's like a bunch of people, and she just starts shooting, and she actually hits her twice. Then after she does this, she runs down the platform around the building right here, takes the gun and shoots herself twice. Or maybe, yeah, because she shot Catherine 3 times. Then she shoots herself twice. She's out of bullets and she doesn't die. She doesn't die. So she actually goes into this building right here. They calls her family. They call the doctors, everything. The ambulance comes and picks her up and picks Catherine up. And both of them survive. Multiple gunshot wounds, and they both survive. They both survive the whole ordeal. Both of them do. And so they both survive, but barely. I think when the ambulance and everyone got them to the hospital, no one actually thought they were going to survive. No one was like, oh, they're going to survive. But they did. Both of them survived the shooting, the self-inflicted shooting and the murder. And this is actually Catherine, this is actually Catherine right here. Once she gets out of the hospital, she gets arraigned. But in the hospital, they're interviewing Catherine, and Catherine says, I want her arrested. I am filing charges on her. She's going to jail for what she did to me. So Catherine was not playing any games. Catherine was like, arrest her. And so once Jeanette is healed, she gets arrested. And she gets released on bond, and they're going to trial. And the police are investigating, and the police get the letter, the crazy letters. The police even interview people at a motel. I think one of them was working at. And people at the motel were even saying they noticed how Jeanette was always buying Catherine candy and flowers and stuff like that. So they noticed that something was going on. And they also noticed the moment where Catherine had stopped being friends and didn't want anything to do with Jeanette. They noticed that off the top immediately. They said as soon as Catherine came back from her trip, she wanted nothing to do with Jeanette. So this is what Catherine looks like. So they did have a picture of Catherine right here. So that's what Catherine looks like. And at this time, they're both in their early 20s. So they had been best friends for several years, and they were both in their 20s when this shooting happened. So basically, they both survived. Catherine presses charges. And then Catherine drops the charges to lesser charges, like they went from felonies to misdemeanors. So they lowered the charges. Catherine went in and said, I would like to lower the charges. I don't want her to be charged with attempted murder. I just want her like disorderly conduct or something like that. So Catherine goes in and actually has the charges not necessarily completely dropped, but has them lower so that Jeanette does not have to spend any jail time. Now, why would she do something like this? Well, as I look through the newspaper, I see a headline that pretty much explains why Catherine was so gung-ho on dropping the charges on Jeanette. And this is the headline that I saw. $5,000 for girl shot by wooer. It looks like Jeanette's dad paid Catherine to drop those charges and paid her $5,000. Now, $5,000 is the equivalent to, in 2023, $5,000 is the equivalent of $85,000. Now, you might say, 85, that's it, the equivalent of 85. But you have to understand, at this time, women did not have the economic opportunities that women have today. So the equivalent of $85,000 is a lot of money to a very young woman. It could really go a long way in helping her start a life. And so she settles out of court for $5,000, and we can honestly assume that Jeanette doesn't have $5,000 because I never even could find that she had a job. But I did find that her dad was a highly successful contractor. And so I'm sure the father paid for her settlement and things like that. So we do know that her parents, Jeanette's parents, decided to send her to a rehab, a psychiatric ward and rehab. And we are getting into some delicate arguments about how did they feel about homosexuality in the 1920s. Did they see it as a mental illness or whatever? I'm not sure they sent her for her falling in love with another woman. I think they sent her for her attachments to people becoming so strong that she would want to hurt them. So she was sent to a psychiatric ward for about a year. And I think that's also probably one of the reasons why Catherine was like, okay, I'm going to drop the charges. Maybe she is mentally ill and she got the help that she needed and she's a better person. So I'll just take the settlement and she can have, I think she got probation or something like that. So the story doesn't end there yet. More of the story is to come. So they settle, and actually Jeanette leaves Catherine alone. She doesn't bother Catherine anymore, and Catherine goes off and lives her life. Fast forward 2 or 3 years, Jeanette is about 26, 27, and she falls in love again. She falls in love with a woman, another woman again, but this time the woman is only 18 years old. So she falls in love with an 18-year-old, and she does the same thing she did with Catherine in terms of trying to woo her, sending her flowers, candy, trying to buy her love almost. And This new woman, Anna, who's just 18, says, no, I don't want this. I will be your friend, but please don't try to overstep these boundaries. And what do you think happened this time? It was the same exact, it's literally a replica. I'm like looking at the paper, and even the newspapers were like an identical situation as the first time. Jeanette is trying to date this girl. The girl rejects her advances, and then Jeanette says, I'm going to kill myself. I'm suicidal. So Anna goes to the police, and this time the police know exactly who Jeanette is, and they know exactly her MO, and they know exactly what's going to happen if they don't step in. So they immediately go and arrest Jeanette. They arrest her. They do not play with this girl. They're like, you are not about to try to shoot up at a public area again. And so they immediately arrest her. And she is charged, and with she is charged. The police are not playing with her or her parents, and she goes to a psychological ward. And she just has this repeated pattern of becoming obsessed with women and then becoming suicidal, and not even just suicidal, but becomes becomes very dangerous when she is rejected by these women. Now, it is important to note, and I kind of missed this, and I want to go back a little bit. Her punishment for shooting Jeanette 3 times was $100 fine, because the charges were dropped significantly. So she didn't have to face jail time, and she was released and things like that. So she has this pattern, and the police jumped on her really quick about this. And so there were other women. So this is a picture of Anna. So she was trying to do the same thing. Now, here's the historically interesting part. The newspapers, when they're addressing this story, don't really know how to describe the relationship. So they will often use terms of, they were just best friends, and she used to buy her stuff. And it's very interesting how women who were pursuing relationships with other women were portrayed in newspapers at this time versus how men who were pursuing relationships with other men were portrayed. So they would use derogatory terms. They would use really strong language when referring to homosexuality in men. But with women, they would say things like, oh, she loved her. Young girls who love each other. It was very much kind of like, it's not real love. It's just girls playing around. That's just what girls do. Like, that is the vibe. That is the impression that I was given when I was reading the newspaper accounts of this relationship and what was actually occurring. So she is from Chicago. This whole situation was in Chicago, and Chicago was very interesting in the 1920s. You would be shocked that in the 1920s, Chicago was very open to homosexuality. 1920s. And so there was this huge, this rising homosexual community in Chicago at the time of the 1920s. And you have to understand, the 1920s is the time period where alcohol was banned, but people were drinking more than they ever drank. Clubs were supposed to be closed, but they were open, and people were drinking and partying and all these things. So we see in Chicago this flourishing of this gay community. It was neighborhoods where you would have gay bars and people out, drag queens, everyone is out doing their thing, and the police aren't really harassing them on a large scale. Now this was a time of extreme economic growth for the United States, and everyone was getting rich, everyone was partying. This is the good times era. And I was just shocked at how okay people were with homosexuality compared to If you look at the decade before and when the Great Depression hits, it was like, oh, gay bad, let's bash them. Everything's horrible with gay people. But in the 1920s in Chicago, it was far more accepted. It was not persecuted like it would be in the next 10 years. And it gave gay people a place to go and meet other people like them. And this could be, relating it back to the case, this could be why Jeanette starts calming down after the second girl, is that she might have gotten into this scene and met other women who also followed her sexual preferences. But we do know at this time period, the Roaring Twenties had a very strong gay scene that was flourishing in places like Harlem, New York, and in Chicago, where people could be out and about and be openly gay and meet other gay people and party and drink and have fun during this time period. 1920s was just a different time, and I think a lot of people who study history would just assume, well, 1920s was probably extremely conservative, and think, no, in the 1920s in these larger towns in the North, homosexuality was more openly accepted and more out there. But we do know that there were about 35 locations in Chicago where gay people can go and not only party, but also discuss homosexuality, discuss, what they're looking for in society, how they would want society to accept them. So a lot of interesting things was happening in the 1920s in Chicago concerning the discussion of homosexuality, giving them places that they can go and meet other homosexual people and not be fearful of their lives and things like that, and also have a good time. So some of these places include the North Side community of Towertown. Towertown was an area, a community where homosexuals could go and socialize and meet local artists and things like that. But what is also interesting, at Chicago at this time, we kind of have the first gay homosexual civil rights organization is created. And let me read this to make sure I get it right. So it was created by Henry Gerber, who was an immigrant and post clerk. He founded the nation's earliest documented gay rights organization in 1924. And they would hand out pamphlets and to the community and things like that to try to get community support. And basically they were disbanded and arrested in the mid 1920s. But you start seeing the organization of gay people. You start seeing them wanting their own spaces so that they could be free and meet other gay people. And it seems like Chicago allowed this to happen. Now, Great Depression hits, everyone's poor. When there is economic stress, and this is just a general lesson in history, when there is economic stress and people are upset about it, politicians know that they cannot fix that economic distress. They know this. They know that it is costly and it's going to take a lot of time and effort to fix the economic distress. And so oftentimes you will see politicians, you will see different organizations will then start attacking certain groups, and homosexuals are one of the groups that they attack. So as the Great Depression started, instead of looking at, this economic issue, we have this economic issue. They'll say things like, we're having this economic issue because of gay people and living their lifestyle, and somehow God is punishing us for that. And so we have to blame the gays. We have to blame the homosexuals. We have to blame the cross-dressers. So they start attacking these groups, and that is what happened in 1930s when 1929, the stock market crash, United States economy just goes in a tailspin and gets horrible, and the good times are over. And so now everyone's like, well, we got to blame somebody. Let's not blame ourselves for overconsumption. And so we're going to blame gay people. And so you see all of those communities kind of stripped in the 1930s that were flourishing in the 1920s. But Allie, her case is, I'm sorry, not Allie, Jeanette's case is interesting because we do get to see some of the difficulties of being homosexual in the 1920s and not really having an outlet, but wanting love, wanting companionship, and the difficulties that gay people, homosexual people had in trying to achieve this type of relationship. And also, let me state this. There is a real possibility that Catherine could have been gay as well, but refused to live that lifestyle because that was not the accepted lifestyle of her family and friends. And that is probably why it could have been difficult. And that is just as logical as anything else, where Jeanette thought that she and Catherine were in this great relationship and loved each other. And then Catherine realizes this is not an acceptable thing, whether it's from her family or whoever, and decides to end the relationship. But it gives us insight into lesbians, which, to be honest, history will often overlook, and we don't really have a lot of information about that. It's just historically women, it's just always joked off as something women do. So that is today's case. I thank you for watching this video if you stay to the end and started just listening to my ramblings. But thank you guys for staying to the end. My name is Angela, and I will see you next time. Ciao, everyone.